Good to join you, Michelle.
Oh, lovely to see you, Gav.
With a cat on your lap.
Yes, this is Mexi, for those of you who don't know. He's a Siamese and he decided he wanted to join us for the recording, so welcome. You will have found, if you have listened to the Eucharistic and Spiritual Communion Liturgy, that we will probably be reading an excerpt from Job. But over and above that, we are also going to be talking into the Gospel, because that's such a meaty story on all sorts of levels. And I'm going to ask Gavin, I'm going to put the ball in his court, and he's going to begin in this wonderful exploratory conversation. So Gavin, why Job? Why Bartimaeus?
Thank you, Michelle. It's an interesting and good question. I always try, I'm so wary being a father, being a person in the world, that if I don't practice what I preach, I'm being a hypocrite of the worst kind of order. And the only people Jesus condemns really are religious leaders who put burdens on people that they themselves won't carry. So I'm very mindful of that. And I was reflecting on the very interesting dynamics in ministry. In my very, very first service after ordination, the first act I was sitting quietly at the back of the church in Evensong, and a really drunk man came in, and I had to remove him from the service and try to minister to him outside, but it was appalling and a waste of time, and it really affected me quite adversely. And then in my most recent service, liturgically, we have our outside service on a Sunday afternoon. We're trying to include the community, and a regular person who's sometimes abusively drunk came, and I felt, I should say, almost just, he came into, from me, my perspective, quite disrespectfully, and I felt that protective instinct coming out, and you invited him to join us, and it worked. And that really touched me and challenged me, because I reflected on him almost being like, the blind Bartimaeus calling out, and people said, "You're making too much noise," and Jesus stopped and engaged with him. And it's that tension, and I've reflected on how many of the aggravating people, the beggars, the people who I find disrespectful or unpleasant, how many of them have I just walked past? How many of them have we collectively just walked past without engaging with them?
That's such an interesting dynamic, because it makes, as you were talking, I was so aware again in that I'm sure that if people had paid attention to Bartimaeus, if they hadn't seen him as part of the scenery and ignored him, he wouldn't have had to shout.
Yes.
He could have just spoken in a normal voice, because people would have given him the space to speak his need and to engage with Jesus, rather than trying to almost discourage him from being part of what they were experiencing. And I don't know, do we sometimes do this as well, where we want to holify something? And so we don't want anything that isn't holy to be part of an experience, by our definition. And of course, holiness is not about protecting people from the real world. It is about bringing the love of Jesus into the context in which we find ourselves.
And that's why it resonated for me with that afternoon service as a symbol. Because he was like blind Bartimaeus, crying out. And it was disruptive. But yet, through that, God can shine.
Yes. And who knows what God did with that?
And we discussed it afterwards and saying, well, who are we? We don't pretend, we know we're not perfect. And maybe that gentleman's imperfections are more open and honest than ours. But, to really, what touched me is, Jesus also doesn't tell him what he needs. And Jesus always asks people. And I so love that about Jesus. Jesus doesn't force us. And he says, "What do you want me to do for you?" Yes. And it's such a profound question, that. And he says, "My teacher, let me see again." And then Jesus says, "Go, your faith has made you well." And of course, it contrasts with I spoke about my spiritual blindness in seeing that man in the worst he'd been. Instead of I'd also seen him at his best, and why at that moment did I choose to remember his worst? And that's been living with me all week. And then when this reading came up, I thought, in what ways are we blind? Am I blind to the goodness in people around me?
Gosh, Gavin, you know what struck me in this story? More on a figurative level? I don't know how Bartimaeus was using his cloak. We aren't told. Is Bartimaeus persona non grata in his family? Because, of course, in that context, being economically poor was seen as a curse from God. Being blind was seen as a curse from God. So most people would have shunned being around him because what if it's infectious, sort of thing. So we don't know. Was he sleeping outside? In which case his only protection from the elements and from coldness would have been the cloak. During the day when it was very hot, did he spread the cloak around him? Did he sit on it like a blanket, a picnic blanket, and ask people to throw coins onto that? So it would have been an essential part of his survival, was the cloak. And I found myself asking, so why did he throw it off? Is there something here that is telling us that sometimes the gifts, the graces, the healings that God wants to give us, we've still got to throw off something? For Bartimaeus, perhaps the cloak represented something of his identity as a beggar. Was it also something of his identity as a person under the curse of God? And by throwing that off and saying, I no longer am going to own that identity. I am going to own the identity Jesus is going to give me. It's going to change my life drastically. There might be some people who don't believe that I have been healed and I have this renewed identity. Myself asking, what is God asking me to let go of in order that God can heal something in me? What am I cloaking myself with and formulating that as my identity? And God is saying, let go of that. I've got a new identity for you. It's just been fascinating me.
That is a fascinating thing for me too, Michelle. Sometimes in my own life, I felt like I'm like a little child, that I want to hang on to my little baubles, and my hands are full, and I'm coming to God saying, you know, here I am, take me, and God's saying, let go of your baubles. But to me, they're very important. But when I have let go of them, God wants to give me so much more, and I don't want those baubles anymore. But it also goes back to that question that Jesus asks him, because it's the same question for us. And I think, you know, there's something in that verse that really touches me, is, teacher, let me see, and by implication, let me follow you, because he follows Jesus.
Yes.
And that implies being a disciple, and I feel perpetually Jesus is asking me that same thing, and I feel Jesus is inviting me, and perhaps he's inviting all of us, to say, instead of what can Jesus do for me, but what can I do for others for Jesus?
Yes, yes.
So it becomes about not getting going back to the trinkets analogy, or hanging on to our cloak analogy, but letting go of our whatever we've been attached to, and going and receiving more. And a friend of mine who had been crippled through polio as a young woman told me how she actually became addicted to being
disabled.
And
that was her image.
It was her image of herself, and she was fine when she was healed. It took real courage to actually let go of that identity, and I think we underestimate Bartimaeus' courage in letting go of that false self, that beggar self. And in what ways do we all do that?
Yes. And what is the invitation Jesus is giving to us with exactly the same words? What do you want me to do for you?
Yeah.
And it does mean standing up and walking towards Jesus even when you know that this is going to dramatically change your life, somehow you know it's worth it. It's really worth it. And the contrast between the crowd, who figuratively can't see, Bartimaeus physically can't see, but spiritually he can see. He can see who Jesus is, and he knows who to turn to.
Yeah, and Jesus so often reminds us there are none so blind as those who will not see.
Yeah.
And you know, we think of these events as a once-off event, but following Jesus on the way is a journey. It's the same for him and for us. It's about continually praying, let me see, Lord, let me see with your eyes. And I find, as you said, and we've discussed it so often, I find this journey exciting, terrifying, but ultimately so life-giving and so meaningful. And sharing this journey with fellow Christians, fellow journeyers of whatever faith, really, I just find gives life meaning.
Sounds like a good note to end on. As you may have realized, this is really just a beginning conversation. So if you'd like to join us on a Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock, we allow for everybody to join in the conversation and explore something of the Bartimaeus story for ourselves, even more, hearing one another's perspectives and engaging in our own growth in that way. So if you can, come and join us, 4 o'clock, just in front of the church.
Yes.
God bless you.
God bless, and thank you for watching. I'll leave you with the kitty.
Thank you.